Good morning. I am Michael Haley, Executive Director for Wake County Economic Development. Thank you for joining our first virtual Economic Development Summit. We have exciting content planned for you over the next 4 weeks that covers important topics in economic development and our local economy. First, a quick thank you. Thank you to our Raleigh Chamber members, our edge investors, and our many partners for continuing to support this community and each other during this time. We also would like to thank our elected officials who have joined us today for their continued leadership. We sincerely appreciate the support of all of our sponsors. Because of their commitment to the summit, we are able to bring you information, resources, and tangible takeaways in a virtual format. Thank you to each of our sponsors. Our gold sponsor, Credit Suisse. Our silver sponsors, City of Raleigh, Office of Economic Development and Innovation, and Highwoods Properties. And our bronze sponsors, Carolina Hurricanes, Martin Marietta, Relate Advocacy, and Wake Technical Community College. Thank you again to our sponsors. During this seminar, let's stay connected. Join today's discussion on Twitter. Use the hashtag EconDevSummit20 and tag us using @RaleighWake or @RaleighChamber. Our seminar today kicks off our first virtual summit. This year's summit will be spread across 4 weeks and will aim to cover topics such as regional recovery post-pandemic, economic mobility and inclusive prosperity, talent pipeline, and perspectives from David Morgan, the CEO of Bandwidth. Although we wish we could be together to share these conversations, we are excited to offer you 4 seminars that are closely related and share how we can move into our next chapter as a community. Today's seminar explores the evolution of economic development and the impact of the pandemic on our regional economy. In a few moments, you'll be hearing from Ted Abernathy as he discusses how economic development and our economy have evolved over the years, a then and now perspective. The impact of the pandemic on our regional economy and our long-term prospects, and the new driving factors of our economy. At the end of the presentation from Ted, we're going to have Q&A sessions, and we're going to be answering questions from you. So we invite you to use the question function, not the chat function, to submit your questions. At any time during the presentation, please submit your questions. If your question isn't answered today, don't worry. We'll be providing a blog from Ted that will address any remaining questions. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ted Abernathy. As many of you know, Ted is the managing partner of Economic Leadership LLC, a consultancy that's working in more than a dozen states to develop economic and workforce strategies. In fact, before we came on, Ted was telling us about how his work in New Mexico that he's doing as we speak. And Ted has over 35 years of experience in directing economic development and workforce development programs. We are very excited to have you, Ted. Thank you so much. You have control of the screen, and we're ready for you to start.
Michael, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Most years I get to spend time with you in front of a group, and I'll admit that getting used to this virtual is hard without audiences. So I'll try to make it as exciting as possible. When in the past, normally when all of you are looking quizzical when I'm throwing up a chart, I try to slow down a little bit, but we'll try to get through them today. And this is a reset. As Michael said, we're going to try to look forward. It's what we think COVID-19 is doing to us a little bit into the past. And for those that were at the Future Conference last year, where we went way back 30 years in the Research Triangle, look forward, I said a few things a year ago, not expecting the whole world to be turned upside down. So I'll try to give you a little bit of insight as how we think that happened. So we came into this year with a solid economy. The annual employment growth had been about 1.5% for 10 years. There's some people who believe it had been going up or going down, but we've been pretty consistent for about a 10-year period nationally for employment growth and GDP growth. It was a consistently strong economy. North Carolina had done a little better, the green line here, a little better than the national average. We had come out of the recession mirroring the national average for the first 5 years, and then have been a little above, took a tiny bit of a downturn, and then last year separated again, growing a little better than the nation. Over the last 5 years, to give you some perspective, we grew at about 10%, adding jobs. The country grew at about 8%. Strong construction, that's driven by our attraction of population, but better overall in every category except the education and health category, and some of that is directly related to some policy issues that we made, choices we've made in North Carolina. But it's a broad-based economic success, and was something that I think you felt locally, that certainly in the Raleigh area, the Charlotte area, in Nashville and Wilmington, you felt like we were growing and being very successful. That job growth, just honing in on the last 5 years, was broad-based. You can see the dark green areas on the map, the metros, whether that's Wilmington or Charlotte or Asheville, or up in the far right corner near Norfolk. Those were the areas that were growing faster than the state average, but most counties were growing. You can see the band in the east and little spotty bands on the south and west where we weren't growing. Those are counties where job losses were still occurring. But those of you with good memories might remember that 3 or 4 years ago, those were a lot more red. So this was an overall recovery and expansion that was impacting most of the state. As we look into this coming year, last year we were again growing faster than the country. You see that 1.9 compared to 1.5. Construction was very strong. Financial services was very strong. And we had a good tourism, leisure, and hospitality were growing. We'd lost a little bit of manufacturing. Our manufacturing is growing a little less than the national average. Some of that was just the nature of what we produce. And moving in through last year, we had some trade issues with China, you might remember, and that was starting to put a drag on the national economy and on some of our manufacturing. In fact, pre-COVID-19, February this year, so before the world changed in March, nationally, these are all the metros. And while Raleigh was still growing strong, we had a lot of places that were already beginning to show the signs of the end of a major expansion. It was the longest expansion on record. There were a lot of places, especially in oil and gas, automotive industry, some places that have direct ties to globalization, that were starting to have some downturns. So as we rewrite history, we'll probably remember that COVID did a lot to the economy, and it certainly did, but we were decelerating as we came into this. This is real investment by non-residential structures, so business investment. You can see the last few quarters coming into 2020, businesses had already been tapering off. So to get us to the COVID-19, we were slowing, but a very long expansion, full employment, near record low unemployment. Consumer confidence was high, household savings rates were good. The housing market was healthy, the commercial real estate market was healthy, we had low interest rates, and we had people in places that weren't being as successful, but we felt pretty good about ourselves. And then this ugly bug came along, and COVID-19 impacted everything. And so I'll go ahead and apologize for charts before we start. As we move forward, every chart that is ever going to be about 2020 is going to look crazy. So when we looked at that chart of all the months, the 113 expansion, you see the last 2 months here, April, we lost 20 million jobs. And if you put that on a chart that was actually 20 million, it would look like this. It's an amazing thing to have happen. And we bounced back, started bouncing back in May. We'll see new job numbers week after next for June. May, that 2.5 million was actually the largest increase in jobs in history. But you can see how far we bounced back was just a little bit. So we have a long way to go. This is the state data. North Carolina actually below the national average in terms of overall losses in employment. It's different. The places that are energy driven or tourism driven took the biggest hits, but overall job losses of about 12% year on year from May of last year. So a big contraction. It's uneven. In the leisure and hospitality, where we closed up, almost every state either closed or restricted their hotels and their restaurants and their gathering places. You can see that there's a 40% job loss from May of 19 to May of 20. In North Carolina, right, about the same. A lot of our numbers look very similar. The one sector that has not been impacted as much negatively is the financial services sector. You can see we actually saw just a tiny bit of job growth in that sector. So go back to February for just a second. And I spoke to a group in February and they said, what are you thinking about in the future? And these were the 5 things I put up in February. The great tech decoupling, as we get further and further away from a good relationship with China, there's a real belief China's latest policy is their 2035 policy of setting their own standards in technology. And so as tech starts moving toward a Western and an Eastern standard, I think that's going to, we get there, is going to have a major impact, especially on U.S. multinationals. The rise of global authoritarianism. We are in a world now with half a dozen major countries that believe in a more hard line. I said in February that I thought the debt that the U.S. had been accumulating was going to be a throttle on growth. Since then, we've added 4 big stimulus bills and added 2.7 trillion to the debt for this year. So long term, that's still an issue. I thought we were moving toward a market correction. You saw some of the numbers from last year, and those corrections happened. And then I said we were vulnerable to pandemics, and I didn't realize we were quite as vulnerable as we thought we were. If you were going to the ACC tournament this year in basketball, you got to feel vulnerability right up front. It's something I try to do every year. And, by the time that you were all settled in, we were canceling. So the vulnerability was there. So now, faced with what we have, and I'm not going to talk about the health issues today. We are certainly still in stage 1. Our stage 1 issues are not settled yet. Around the country, the Texas governor this morning suggested that people start staying at home more. So we're going to have some ups and downs as we go forward. But as we come out of this, there'll be a next new normal. And last year, there were 4 trends that I told you about that are still here, I think. They were the fact that we were getting faster. Everything was moving through acceleration faster, that we were hyper-connected through we weren't talking about Zoom back then or WebEx, but we were talking about our connectivity, that there was a lot of disruption and that we were getting more complex. So when Michael and the team asked me to talk about this today, I did some lots of research and deep thought, and I said, you know what? Those 4 are still here. Nothing's changed. In fact, a lot of things pre-COVID haven't changed, and we'll be smart to remember all the things we were worried about that actually probably got slightly worse. So all of those things are there. In fact, when you think about disruption, I would argue that we're now in this accelerated disruption phase. Think about just what's happened to Airbnb or American Airlines during the pandemic, or what on the other side has happened to Amazon or Grubhub. Amazon's added 175,000 new people. On one side, you're laying off people, on the other side, you're adding. And in every industry, there's this give and take. If you look at year-over-year sales just in retail, Amazon and Target and Lowe's, they're all up, but another whole group are way down. And so this industry and company disruption is more accelerated than even before. We also have talked in the past that with the triangle moving forward, that 3 things were really impacting competitiveness. The idea of winners and losers around the country, place-based winners and losers, talent wars, and then business dynamism beginning to slow dramatically in the U.S. So when we think about winners and losers, the good news is that North Carolina is still one of those states that is going to be on the winning side. The winning side of so many of these issues. We are still a state that our GDP, our wages, and our overall job growth has been growing. We're a state that is well ranked by all the people who rank us, so Forbes and CNBC and chief executives. When we look at manufacturing, and we do these big data junkie things that look at factors all over the place, North Carolina is still a top 10 state for manufacturing. And every year, as you know, we do a lot of work for the Raleigh Chamber, and Raleigh still ends up 1, I think the worst ever, 2, in terms of the top 100 metro ranking. So the momentum's still good, but our business cost and climate and our talent index drive us to those #1 things. So while there are winners and losers, everything that I have seen both before and after COVID says that Raleigh and Durham and the Triangle overall are going to be winners moving forward. In fact, a new study came out on durable employment as a percentage of the total employment. Durham ended up #1. Again, Raleigh top 10. A mix of government jobs and professional and technical jobs, things that are not as impacted by the ups and downs generated through the pandemic. The talent wars is worth thinking about. Before we started, we were worried about having enough people because we had record low unemployment. We now have record high unemployment over the last couple of months. But the other thing was the quality of the labor, whether it had the skills or not. You can make a really good argument that not only are people going to come back to the workforce in less numbers, people are going to stay home and take care of kids or grandma or do other things, start their own business. I think the quantity issues are not going to solve themselves, but the skill issues are probably going to get worse. As you move forward, there are more skills that you need. You think about working from home, and we'll talk about remote in a few minutes. You begin to have different skills, different technological skills, and you're going to see some integration skills with technology that are different. So we're going to come out of talent wars not feeling a whole lot better about ourselves. Population growth has been concentrated, and we've been lucky in the Triangle and in Wake County that we have been able to attract and grow our labor pool in ways other parts of the country have not. When you look forward for the next 10 years, working age population, look at all the states whose working age population is expected to shrink. And so we're in a good position here, but that's not a national phenomenon. There are lots of states, upper Midwest and the Northeast, that are going to be struggling dramatically. That's going to change the landscape for economic development again. In the 80s and 90s, the Triangle started prospecting, is what it was called, in the Northeast and in Ohio and Michigan because we had a better overall business climate and cost of doing business. Well, in the future, we're going to be selling our talent. We're going to be selling our ability to attract and train talent. And that's going to continue to increase the evolution of what economic developers are doing. We're going to have to measure it too. We do a talent attraction index, and Raleigh finished #3 in our latest one. This is for all 933 metros and micros around the country. This is based on the people we have, but also our ability to attract them moving forward. And dynamism, we said last year that dynamism was getting to be a problem because our business startup rate had fallen to an all-time low. And so we were actually losing more businesses than we were starting. Well, I'm sorry to say that when you put that with what's going on with COVID-19, we've got 28 million small businesses in the U.S. People are suggesting that up to 40% of them could be in real trouble, maybe 28% permanently closing, but others weakened. And so the small business sector is going to need a lot of help as we come out of this. Another change in economic development policy around the country has been a lot more focus on small and mid-sized businesses, looking at how you help their cash flows, how you help their supply chains. All of that will be more of what communities are looking at to try to strengthen themselves going forward. So those 7 that we first talked about last year, acceleration, hyperconnectivity, disruption, complexity, winners and losers, talent, and declining business dynamism are still here. None of those trends have markedly changed, but COVID has put us in a position where we're going to have to think about a few other things. The first is remote everything. It is a very easy thing to say right now because it's one of the easiest predictions you'll ever see a futurist make, but everybody worked, but we also started getting groceries delivered. And some of you have always had groceries delivered. I have too. But the number of people who have had first-time grocery delivery has almost doubled. Banking, you could remote bank. Many of us did for a long time. But I talked to a president of a bank in Arkansas a week ago, said that the amount of remote banking that they were doing was 4 times what they had ever been. And the number one thing the client said to them is, well, why didn't you tell us you had this? It's so easy. And he was like, well, we ran commercials for 2 years and nobody wanted to do it. Think about exercise at home. telemedicine, or entertainment, all more remote, having a much higher footprint. Second thing is more robots. Robots do not get COVID-19. They are not subject to stay-at-home orders. And you can expect every industry, but manufacturing was already big into robotics. We're starting to see it in construction, but expect a lot more healthcare robots, a lot more retail sales robots, a lot more home health aides and elderly health aides. You're going to see a flood of robots into the marketplace. And from a human resources standpoint, a client or an employee's ability to integrate with robots or technology is going to be a rising skill set. Are they able to value add with the machinery or the automation that's taking place? Another thing that's going to really impact us, and we're not ready to talk about it yet, it seems like, is the geomuddle that's going on in the world. Think back to the turn of the year. In January, we were talking about Brexit. We were talking about China building airstrips in the South China Sea. We were talking about Hong Kong and their demonstrations. We were talking about Erdogan in Turkey and his change in making Turkey much less secular. We're talking about Brazil's new presidents, North Korea. The world was a very complex state, and we were trying to figure out our place in that. Globalization was beginning to change, and so when you think about the impacts of COVID, you're going to see reshoring, you're going to see supply chain evolution that's going to impact economic developers, but there's going to be opportunities in biopharma, in food, in medical devices, and defense industries. We figured out somewhere along the way that we don't produce all the things we need here in America. And there's a reason for that. Globalization tries to deal with the efficiencies of having things produced in a place where it's the lowest cost and highest value. But we figured out that we need to have some of that reshored. So you're going to see that. You're going to see shorter and more redundant supply chains. It's going to take out some of the efficiency, which probably is going to raise some prices along the way. But I expect a lot of that to happen as we move forward. Over the last 4 years, there's been a political movement to try to reshore things. And what's really happened has been a nearshoring. Mexico has been the recipient of most of the major projects moving back to North America. And as we nearshore our supply chain going forward, you're probably going to see a Mexico-U.S. Renewed interest in each other because our supply chains are going to get more and more intertwined. North Carolina needs to worry a little bit. We're one of the states that has been the most successful in attracting direct foreign investment over the years. We have a large number of major foreign companies in the state that are a huge impact on our economy. And our relationships with the rest of the world matters as we go forward. So world merchandising had slowed down. Globalization took its first major hit in 2007 and 8. It was growing, and we had been moving forward since the early 90s in a big way, but we reset the level of globalization after the 2008 financial scare. And now most people believe we're about to reset it again to a lower level. So you're going to see less globalization. There's going to be more things made at home, but it's also going to be put a pressure on the U.S. to be really resilient with its home-based stuff. If we have a bad crop and we're not importing from somewhere else, then there's things you might not be able to get, or you're going to be able to see some prices rise in key areas. Another thing that gets a lot of discussion, and one of the trends that I think is really open for discussion, is how people are going to decide in the future where they live. The 4 areas that most people consider when they're looking after having a job is safety, health, housing, and education. And a lot of people say everybody's going to leave the cities. Well, people are already leaving major gateway cities, mostly because of cost. So New York and Chicago and Seattle and Los Angeles were already shrinking. And as we look forward, the question is, are people going to run away from other more dense areas? The last 10 years would suggest not to expect rural everything to be growing. In fact, all the growth, all the domestic migration in the last 10 years has been in places that were 100,000 to 1 million. So the biggest places were losing, the smallest places were losing. And it was the mid-market areas, the, if you will, the Raleighs of the world, the Nashvilles of the world, that were really being the recipient of this movement. So go forward, I think it's realistic to expect that some dense urban residential construction might slow, but I think that places that are less dense but still have the urban amenities are the most likely to grow. We're going to see real estate shifts. I think we already knew that retail was having a change as we went into this. So what happened over 10 years is the last 10 years is we went from 5% online e-commerce to about 15%. In the last couple months, we've gone to almost 30%. And we're not all going to do that. Some of us will go back to stores, and we like shopping, but we've trained a lot of people now to talk to their little Alexa machine and tell them to deliver stuff, and it just shows up. And so brick and mortar retail that was weak before this is going to be weaker coming out of it. The office space is going to have a short-term interesting thing. We're going to work from home, but when we go into the office, we're going to have to be more spread out. So the square foot per worker had been coming down for a long time. And now I think we're going to have to give people a little more space, but I think they're probably not going to come in as often. How we clean, how we do other things is going to have more of an impact on the real estate than anything else. Our consumer is going to be more frugal. We're scared. We don't know what the future is going to lend. And so there's going to be a rising savings rate. People are going to be less mobile. Both goods and people will move a little less. The experience economy is going to take a hit. Hotels, airlines, tourism are going to be slow to come back. If you look at savings rate before the Great Recession, we were averaging in America 3-4% family savings rate. After the recession, we leveled in after an initial scare. We leveled in at 7-8%. Now the question, we're saving 13-14% in March and April, but the question is, what are we going to save for the future? There are places like China that people have always saved a third because they weren't certain about their economic future. I think it's realistic to believe that savings rates are going to go up a few more percentage points. And when they do, that's a few less percentage points that are in our economy because we're a 2/3 consumption economy. In every industry is going to have very different impacts. If you're in healthcare, you're going to see reshoring of critical medical production. You're going to have more skilled nurses or harder to recruit. And if we can't import foreign nurses, we're going to have real shortages. You're going to see some increased investment in public health. And then I think an explosion of telemedicine. If you look at what's happened to telemedicine just in the last couple months, people who have never had an office visit before on a video screen are doing it now. Seems to be working. I doubt people will go back the other way. If you're in higher education, we have so many colleges and universities in our area that are so important to our economy, but this explosion of online learning is going to have repercussions. Short term, the disruption in everything from continuing spread of COVID-19, sports and research and everything's disrupted. But when we come back, the question is, how many of the students really come back? The current estimate is that we're going to lose this fall about 15% of our domestic students and a much higher percentage of our international students. State support is going to be tough for the next few years. Endowments and gifts will probably go down. You're going to see a lot of small private schools around the country close just because they don't have the cushion. And there's going to be pressure for public schools to once again look at merging administrations or merging campuses. State and local government will be hit hard. After the Great Recession, there were 750,000 jobs cut. It took several years. In fact, it was almost 6 years before there was some normalcy back in the governments. So the first set of estimates was 18 to 23% reduction next year. A little bit of a lag on tax revenues. And to get revenues back, a lot of estimates now are saying 6 to 7, and I've seen up to 10 years. And so you're going to see pullbacks in local government spending. By the way, I think we all had a digital epiphany We have been talking about the importance of broadband forever, and now everybody who wasn't convinced is convinced that without broadband, you can't get past these kind of shocks to the system. So I'd expect a renewed interest in broadband, especially into our rural parts of the state. When you look at the recession that we're currently in, when do we get it back? The Congressional Budget Office is suggesting maybe 2030. Other people are suggesting a V shape where we get back immediately. The bright green is our estimate. We think we'll bounce back a lot of jobs very quickly, but not all the way back. And then to get all the way back is going to take quite a bit of time. So there's too many ripples and shocks into the system to think we'll get all the way back very quickly. If you want to track what's happening, I think if you start looking at the difference between permanent and temporary jobs as we come back, that's a good thing. Look at traffic counts and gas prices. Traffic counts are much lower and gas prices are lower. As they start to creep back up, you'll understand the economy's opening up again. Watch those consumer confidence numbers and overall retail spending. I think it's going to be fascinating to look at student counts this fall, everything from preschool to higher ed, and see how many parents let their kids come back to school. I don't think that we have a good handle on that yet, and that'll ripple again through the economy. RDU is one of the gems of our region, and passenger counts are down, to very low levels. I think that before air travel gets back, you may be a decade to getting people comfortable with getting in an airplane again to the levels we were in 2019. Hotel occupancy is going to take a hit for several years. It'll come back slow. And then business formations, we'll be able to see if people are going to be able to start new businesses in the same level of impact that they were before. The other thing that everybody should think about is that some of these impacts are echoes. We haven't started the foreclosures yet. We haven't seen the impact on rural hospitals and the cuts they'll have to make. You're starting to see government cuts, but they'll probably happen for years. And so the echo impacts of this, some small businesses have just held on and they're opening back up. But if the numbers of people coming back to restaurants or movie theaters or other things aren't to the level that they were before, more of those businesses will be hit somewhere along the way. So we've got a global pandemic that created a global recession that is exacerbated by both international and domestic politics. And then over the last month or so, we've had a new variable come into the business risk, which is the polarization issues that we have, the equity issues that have come up. Black Lives Matter, with echoes back of, we are the 99% from a few years ago. This level of civil unrest that we're seeing in the country it appears to be one of the strongest that we have seen back for several decades. And the question becomes, what is all that going to do to the economic recovery? You're going to have a whole discussion on this at one of the upcoming webinars. But when you think about it economically, the employment to population ratio for every sector of the economy, for Blacks, whites, Hispanics, took a huge hit along with the shutdown that was part of COVID-19. So we know that everybody sort of feels common pain right now economically. Social justice issues, police issues, different. But economically, you see a lot of pain out there. But if you look longitudinally, there's a lot of reasons for it. Median household income by race has always been uneven. If you look back a long way, you're looking at, this goes back 30 years and very little progress, frankly. If you look toward women, median income is lower for women across every worker class. And so those issues have been here for a long time. This May, if you look at unemployment by race, everybody's unemployment went up, but white unemployment's 12% and African American unemployment's 28%. There's still a big difference. It's not just race. Educational level makes a huge difference. And if you don't have a high school degree now, you're about 20% unemployed. If you have a college degree, you haven't got to 7.5%. And it's also true that age makes a huge difference. Our younger workers have been disproportionately impacted. So as we go, if we start examining COVID-19 impacts, it's younger workers, it's workers at lower wage jobs, a lot in the service sector, that were dramatically impacted by this. That combined with political issues and being an election year and everything else creates some civil unrest typically, but this year triggered by some other events. That's going to play a role in our economic recovery, probably in our elections, but also into our recovery from the pandemic. So it's not something that can be ignored as we go forward. It will have an impact, and so it's worth bringing up as we go through. What happens to it, I have no idea. We are having a lot of talking and yelling at this point, but the actions are what's needed to try to, if you're going to try to address this. So over the next year or so, I think as Raleigh and Wake County and the Triangle think about equity issues and fairness issues, the economic lens on that is going to be about what do you do? Because there have been a lot of things tried for the last 50 years economically, and some of them have worked and there's demonstrated success, some of them have not. So just some final thoughts for you as you go forward. COVID-19 impacts, there's going to be some negative, some positive. It's hard to say, there are positive impacts of a pandemic, but if you were making freezers at the early part of the pandemic or bicycles now, you've never had this much business. Certainly if you're an online tech company, you're doing well, but all of those are going to come in waves over the next couple of years, and just watch them. If a company can do something with a robot, it's going to do it going forward. So expect an explosion in your interaction with robots and your companies. Expect a surge in how we look at artificial intelligence and virtual and augmented reality. All of those can help, and they're going to be part of going forward. Currently, we're all talking resilience and redundancy and reshoring. And we're going to do that. And I think that especially for food, defense, and medical, you're going to see a lot of it. But eventually someone's going to say, well, that's not really efficient. I can do it efficient somewhere else. So we're going to have positives, and there's going to be some resilience and other things that are part of our recovery. But in the end, it won't level out as far down as we think it will, because efficiency will still be a watchword. Smart places are doing a lot of scenario planning now. You're blessed. We all are to be in a community with a lot of leadership that is looking forward, that keeps their eyes on the horizon, and that's going to be a big part of us going forward. So I'm going to stop there, Michael, and save that last 20 minutes for Q&A. I think somebody on your team is going to take away that. All good.
Awesome. Well, hey, Ted, thank you so much for the presentation. It was amazing. So everyone, we're going to start the Q&A session as Ted said. So now's our chance to ask questions. As a reminder, you can submit questions using the question function, not the chat function. So our first question today, Ted, comes from that chat, from that question function. Golly, I said it myself. And it comes about the great decoupling you mentioned. Can you expand a little bit more about this tech decoupling that you mentioned?
Yeah, America has set the standards for technology worldwide for a long time. So our big IT platforms are what people use around the world. China, as you might imagine, doesn't particularly like that. And so the latest plan released, China's big on releasing 5-year, 10-year plans. They do a lot more of that than we typically do. And their latest plan is a 2035 plan to create a China standard around the world. And so that tech companies operating in China would have to operate on their platforms with their rules and whatever. United States we're a mixed bag when it comes to this around the world. I mean, the world would like to have one set of accounting rules and one set of tech rules and one, and we would too, as long as it's ours. But China has decided that one of the ways for them to leap forward in a technology is to create their own platform. So you wouldn't go to a Google search of the internet, it would be another internet. You wouldn't have the same rules and regs. And there's a lot of discussion about whether, what this means long term. But as we integrate them now, Michael, the problem is that you're integrating things that have defense implications or other implications. And you've started seeing the US say, well, this China company can't do that or can't do this. And so China's saying, all right, we're going to need to create our own set of rules. So that's the decoupling we're talking about.
Thanks. Thank you, Ted. One of the questions or one of the points you raised was in terms of domestic migration and seeing domestic migration gains in metro areas like the Raleigh, Cary Metro, Wake County specifically. In your opinion, another question that we're getting, in your opinion, does COVID-19 high rates of infection in more dense metros, these stay-at-home orders, do you see that as an acceleration point for this type of growth, or does that domestic migration change in another way?
So two things. One, we're still in stage one. And if you look at the North Carolina maps by county or by census tract today, there's a lot of places that aren't metros that have pretty dense outbreaks. So I invite you to pull up, I think it's RAL that does it every day, pull up their map and look at Eastern North Carolina and the rural areas and look how dense some of the outbreaks have been. So it made sense that gateway cities with lots of people traveling would be the early part of COVID-19. So I'm not sure that it won't spread through rural areas anyway. Then you have to wage what's the quality of health care and those issues. I don't, as I said, I think places like Raleigh do great going forward. I don't think this interrupts what made us competitive before. It will still be here afterwards, assuming that we're still the state capital and we still have the research that we have and we still have the universities, that we're still placed very well. But I can see people choosing to live in some halo locations. So, Wilson becomes a little more attractive. Benson becomes a little more attractive. Elon, people might choose that, but only if they can get the urban amenities that they already want, the high-speed internet, the access to things. Some things changed. I think outdoor recreation is going to become a more impactful choice as opposed to, individual bar scene, although I watched the pictures of Glenwood South and I'm not sure that anybody's missing a beat there. So I think that there will be some changes, but I don't think it's going to do anything but accelerate what was already the trends.
Yeah. Thank you, Ted, for that. We're getting several questions related to workforce development and training, because you mentioned that as an important aspect of not only the impacts of COVID-19, but also an important element of our recovery. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of these questions together. One element that you've talked a lot about recently has been the decline in labor participation rates in the United States. Couple that with the need, obviously continued prior to the pandemic, but near full employment. So there was still a large number of jobs that were open. So low labor force participation rates, lots of jobs being open. And now all of a sudden you throw into the mix the need to reskill a large number of people for either filling old jobs or new jobs as companies have pivoted. So a couple of questions there, but really maybe the key to that is, what do you see the workforce development system, its response to sort of those sort of elements, this sort of all of a sudden this confluence of many issues?
Yeah, so I'm really worried about labor force participation rates. I can see a lot of people now deciding that they're not sending their kids to daycare. They're worried about it, so they're going to keep the neighbors' kids and stay home. And the auxiliary building debate in Raleigh that y'all had for the last forever is going to get exacerbated because everybody, you're going to want to keep grandma home. You're going to want to put your office there. You're going to see a lot of pressure around those issues. The other thing is work has changed permanently. I'm doing a talk tomorrow for the American Society of Employers, and you know, human resource people are going to figure out in the future, accelerated, how do you integrate people skills with automation skills with part-time people skills? So gig economy or whatever, you're going to see a new platform. If you have to work remotely and you have to work with people you don't know because they were brought in temporarily, and you have to use automated systems, so it means there's going to be more training required. There's going to be more assessment modeling. I told someone yesterday that my first job, my first managerial job was in 1982, and the 1 Minute Manager had just come out, and that was the hottest book in the world. And for those of you who want to read it, go read it. But if you don't, what it basically says is that you have to set really clear goals, and you have to give continuous feedback. That's the book. And you know, I think that now, how do we monitor that when we have more remoteness or more transition? So for us, Wake Tech, it will become the most amazingly important thing in the world to respond to a credentialing world and a retraining world that's out there. It is a major competitive factor going forward. Companies aren't going to know what they need. You're going to be selling, when you talk to them, Michael, your ability to adjust to whatever it is. Not that I have this course that does this, but I have this system, this capacity to do whatever it is. It doesn't get any less important. It gets much more.
That's exactly right. And our workforce partners, capital area, Wake Tech, as well as our university partners, such critical components of who we are. Ted, one of your statements in that response has generated a couple of questions, particularly around the future to work, or the future of work, and a couple of questions related to that, and the impacts on commercial real estate and development here in our market. So, in essence, what we're seeing now is this very quick. We literally pivoted as a society to work remote. It seemed literally overnight. Not seemed, it was overnight. From one day we were in the office, and the next day we were remote. There's a lot of discussion around trends related to that will continue over time. Here's a bit of a question: is does that trend truly continue even after we find a vaccine, or once we find a vaccine, as Americans are want to do, that we'll say, gosh, let's go back to the way things were? Or do you see this impacting commercial real estate over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, major impacts. So before this happened, and I know I sound like a broken record of this, but last year, one of the things we were talking about is how hard it was to get employees because they wanted more flexibility. You know, they wanted to be able to go to the doctor when they need to go to the doctor, or take a half hour and talk on the phone, but then be able to work all night. I mean, nothing changed except that we let them do it now, and now they want to do it more. So there'll be a lot of people study whether or not it has been profitable or efficient to do this. But early returns are that companies are happy and people are happy. Now, the question is going to be, how do you replace the value that you got from people colliding with imagination, and the workplace where you had different people coming up with new ideas because they were put in the same space? So it's going to be a hybrid. People can't say, most jobs can't say, you just go live on the Rocky Mountains and send your stuff in. I mean, it's not going to be that. We're going to have to use these type of platforms that you and I are on now to make sure that we have increased communication, increased collaboration, but maybe increased flexibility also. So yes, it's going to impact retail markets. Probably going to take a hit. Industrial and warehouse markets probably go up. You're probably going to have higher demand. And I think the office market is the $64,000 question. I think we're probably reconfiguring them, but the head counts are definitely going to go down for full-time head counts.
Thank you. I agree. It's interesting, like you said earlier, Ted. We're still so early into this that these longer-term trends are certainly hard to account for or even understand yet in a lot of cases. So Ted, let me ask you a question again. In your intro, we talked about it. You've had this 35-year experience and this wonderful ability to reach across the entire United States and internationally in working in Africa and Europe, as I know you've done. And so you've got this wonderful experience. Okay, so I'll put you on the spot with that experience. If you could do sort of one thing to position this market for the best possible recovery it could have, what would that one thing be, or what would that combination of things be?
Uh, I think two things, Michael. First is I would dig deep into my existing anchor businesses and do a little shifting toward their supply chain issues. Uh, they're having to think about them. The greatest answer in the world would be, well, they're down the street. So we always want to do that, but we find companies are more willing right now to share that. So I would try to strengthen my existing businesses by working through their supply chain. The other is I do what Raleigh can do very well, which is be aware of where the world is trending. And right now, I mean, you know that every year we do NC Tech's tech report. We are the #1 state for females every year in technology. Raleigh just ended up the #1 state, #1 city, I think, or top 10 city for females starting business. We seem to be doing better in that things. Well, we can do that with everybody, every race, but socioeconomic issues are not going away. There's an awakening that is there. I think dealing with those things honestly. One of the things that's always helped this part of the world is we're so crazy analytical that we tend to just start looking at data and try to fix it. And so I think just continuing to be that analytical, trying to identify problems and deal with it. So I do those two things: is try to deal with issues that are arising head on and dig deep into your existing companies.
That's exactly right, Ted. And like you said, first of all, two things that I know you've sort of espoused for a long time is one, the most important business is an existing business that you have in your community. And any economic development strategy that doesn't place existing businesses at the forefront or the most important is a bad economic development strategy to start with, because they're one that what fuels our economy. Two, it's what employs our neighbors and our friends, and so that's absolutely critical to do. And I appreciate your point about the broad base of and widely shared opportunity for people in a community. That's absolutely important, and it's a good segue for our next session when we're going to talk to leaders about that inclusive prosperity and what we can do. So, Ted, thank you so much. And a couple quick points for me before we conclude. Very quickly, you know, I love to do takeaways, so I got 4 quick takeaways, Ted, because you've inspired me to do those. So, first, what I heard today is the only constant is disruption, right? And you mentioned that, Ted, not only in industry but in our communities. So we need to understand that disruption is part of who this community is. We're an innovative, disruptive economy, and so we know that's going to occur. 2, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Ted, you mentioned sort of in the pre and post issues regarding some of who we are and who we can be pre and post pandemic remain, and many of them just may be accelerated. So for us, that again, the more they change, a lot of times the more they stay the same. Third, talent remains critical. We've said that over and over again. Ted, you have been a leader in that for sure, as well as the Raleigh Chamber and Wake County Economic Development. But it remains even more critical today with the need for reskilling. You mentioned quality and quantity of talent. The new work environments are going to challenge talent and how we manage and work with talent. And then plus talent attraction is going to be important as work changes, as workers are able to work in more locations and select those locations. It's going to be important. And then finally, sort of something I heard or I took away from you, Ted, today was the notion of reset, ready, go. For us, it really is a reset of our entire global economy that was underway, but our fundamentals here in this market will really take us a long way. So again, Ted, thank you so much for your presentation today. Your insights are always so welcome and exciting. And thanks to all of our audience members. Thank you for your participation. So many great questions, some of which are still coming in. Again, I'll reiterate that Ted's going to author a blog for us that we're going to be sending out to this group, and he will take into account some of those questions from you. So again, thank you so much for that. A quick thanks again to our sponsors for helping to support this event. Again, our gold sponsor, Credit Suisse, our silver sponsors, the City of Raleigh, Office of Economic Development and Innovation, Highwoods Properties, our bronze sponsors, the Carolina Hurricanes, Martin Marietta, Relate Advocacy, and Wake Technical Community College. Thank you so much for our sponsors. As I mentioned earlier, our next seminar in this series will be on July 1st at 10 a.m. and we'll cover economic mobility and inclusive prosperity. You just heard Ted mention how important that's going to be for our community's future. And we are very excited to be hearing from Marianne Baldwin, Mayor of City of Raleigh, Greg Ford, the Chairman of the Wake County Board of Commissioners, and Merritt Gutman, the non-resident Senior Fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. Again, if you haven't registered for the entire summit, you can register for the remaining individual events at raleigh-chamber.org. And in the coming days, you'll receive a recording of this conversation along with the blog, along with Ted's blog recapping this discussion. Again, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you, Ted, for joining us. And thank you all for being here today, and have a great day.